basic walk cycle in 3D in real time. The way that I tend to do it is the layered fashion rather than pose to pose. So I'll be working with individual channels of movement and eventually arriving at the finished poses when it's all said and done. So to get started here, I'm going to do a 24 frame walk cycle. So frames 1 and 25 will be the same pose, but I'm never going to see frame 25. So I'll be working with it, but eventually we'll turn that off and only see frames 1 through 24. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just try to get an establishment of where the contact frames are and the passing frames. It's good to put the hips down just a little bit, get a little bit of slack in the knees. And then what I can do is just sort of round these numbers. These numbers don't really mean anything to me personally, so I'm just trying to get something here that I can remember, because whatever I do on frames 1 and 25, I'm going to have to do the opposite on frames 13 later. So there's frames 1, here's frames 25, just saving the keyframes. I'm including the up and down movement because I want the feet to be locked on the ground, so the pose is already good there. Here I'll go ahead and save a keyframe, but I'm going to change the pose. I've got auto key on, so the keyframes are being saved as I'm moving it. And this should work now, just sort of a cross-country skier type of look. And what I'm going to do here, this is just sort of a good thing to remember, is to set the Z translations, the forward and back movement of the leg, to linear. And that's going to be easier to lock the feet down later. I'm going to cycle the curves here. I've got my cycle windows sort of torn off because I'm going to be using them quite a bit. And there we have the first part of the walk cycle. So the next thing to do is just try to figure out when's the passing frame, when is the foot off the ground, the halfway mark between the two contact frames. And this foot's going forward, so I'm just going to save a keyframe, again just rounding it up. Whatever's happening at frame 7 for one foot is going to be happening at frame 19 for the other foot. And I'm not worried so much about if that's the perfect height or the perfect pose, because this is just trying to get some movement down. I always think of it as if you're sculpting or something like that, you're just trying to get the clay on the table right now. You're not really worrying so much about if it's the perfect form and figure of the sculpture. Now that I have this worked out, contact frames and passing frames, it's good to go into the hips. So for the hip animation, you can approach it any way that you feel is the most intuitive. For me, when I look at a walk cycle, I see the up and down movement. That's the most obvious type of movement, at least for a character with this type of anatomy. So to establish the up and down movement, I'm going to try to figure out first where that contact frame is here at 13. And what I find is that 1 or 2 frames before the contact frame is when the hip is in the high position. So I'm just going to get there and save a keyframe. And whatever's happening at frame 12 is also going to be happening at frame 24 to make the cycle work. So now, as the foot's gone down on the ground, it's ready to receive the weight of the hips. So I'm just going to pull that down, and now you'll see the first little up and down movement. We can look at the graph editor here to see what the hip curve looks like, and we can cycle that. And in cycling that, we should be able to see a repeating kind of effect. There's a little stutter there. That's because we're playing frames 1 and 25 together. That'll go away when we only play up to 24 frames. So let's just assume that we're happy with this. We can always change it later. The next thing to do is to think about, that's a little bit of the weight. What's happening with the overlap? What's the root of the overlap movement? And here at the contact frame, the hips will probably be rotated back like so. So go ahead and save a keyframe for that. Whatever's going on at frame 13 is also at frame 25. And as the weight falls forward, the hips are going to pivot forward. So you see that falling movement happening. And I think it's good sometimes to get like a little bit of offset between these two. So maybe we'll move that just a little bit further. So it's happening after the up and down movement. Got everything cycling now, so we can just see how that looks. And it's really exaggerated, so I'm just going to pull back on that a little bit just by scaling this slightly. Try like that. I'll leave it like that for now and come back to it later again to see if we need to adjust it. Most likely we will. So the next thing I'm going to do, that's sort of dealing with the weight. The other thing to deal with is the locomotion. And in the locomotion, I'm thinking about the swinging of the hips. What is it that's making that foot go forward? And the root of that movement is happening here in the hips. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a pivot there. And whatever's going on at frame 25 is also going to be here at frame 1. Sorry, vice versa. And at frame 13, I'll have the opposite because the other foot is forward. So minus 15. We can see what that looks like. All right, so you start to see a little bit of what the locomotion is behind the walk cycle. And whatever's going on here at the contact frame, we're going to have something happening at the passing frame. And there's a number of ways you can do this. You can always make them go down like so. I want to do something a little bit dynamic and kind of animated feeling. So I'm going to lift the hips up to accentuate the lifting of the foot up. So whatever I have here at frame 7, I'm going to have the opposite here at frame 19, minus 7. And then whatever I have at frame 7 is also going to have to be further on down the cycle. And I've already sort of worked out that that is going to be frame 31. So I can just save the keyframe here, move that on down to frame 31, and cycle. All right. The last thing here that's really important to do is to think about the weight shift, because when all the weight is on this foot, the hips are going to have to be over that foot, and you can start to see that sort of line getting worked out there. So I save a keyframe there. Frame 19, I can do the opposite. And then same type of thing. I want to copy this keyframe and move it on down to frame 31. All right, so everything's really exaggerated, and this isn't a bad time to sort of pull back, make everything slightly less big. It's good to make it big in the beginning because you can at least see it working, see how it's happening, and then just pull back slightly. About 70% on these, but again, you just sort of feel it. That looks like. So he's a little bit bouncy. Maybe we can pull back on this a little bit. Slightly less up and down movement. Maybe that's too much taken out. Okay, so that's probably good enough for now. We can always come back in and polish up what's going on the hips, but it's enough information about the movement to let us move now into the feet. Okay, so moving now to the feet. It's easier just to choose one foot to work with, and then you can copy and paste the animation of one to the other. That's one of the nice things about working on cycles. So I'm going to pick this one because it's in front. And here is where the contact frame is, and I want to get this sort of heel-toe kind of action happening. There's going to be the heel on the ground and the toe up here, but about 2 frames later is when the foot will be flat on the ground. So I'm going to save a keyframe for that first. And then right at the contact frame, I can do that. I'll fix these intersections later. I'm more of a fan of sort of the old school rigs. I don't really like the reverse foot too much. It's just a personal preference, but use what feels good for you. And I'm saving the translation in Y and the X here because that feels to me like the last time I'm going to see the foot flat on the ground like that. heel up, I can rotate the foot. Now there's some advantages to using the reverse foot setup to do this, but those advantages give you some disadvantages in other areas. I just find this to be the lesser of two evils. So there you go. That's the first part, and it doesn't really feel like it's got a lot of thrust to it. And part of what happens here is that once you lift up the foot right there, you lose a little bit of what makes it push off the heel, push off the ground. So if I grab these curves here, move them back, I can reestablish a little bit of the thrust of the foot there. Then what I also need to do is once the foot's in the air, it's better to give it a little bit of hang time. So what I initially did by using these linear curves here when the foot goes flat on the ground works in that moment, but when the foot's in the air, it doesn't work as much. So I'm going to break these, make them flat tangents like that, and even give the foot a little bit more